21 miles. That is the narrowest point of the Strait of Hormuz. To the casual observer, it's a mere geographical bottleneck. To the global economy, it is the jugular vein. As we navigate the volatility of 2026, 20% of the world's petroleum is currently caught in a geopolitical vice. The geography is set, but the tension is rising. With 20% of global oil passing through this narrow neck, the Strait of Hormuz has become a high-stakes tactical chessboard. On one side, the U.S. Fifth Fleet maintains a carrier strike group presence, using sheer naval power to ensure freedom of navigation. But they face a non-traditional threat. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps relies on asymmetric warfare, deploying hundreds of fast attack craft and drone swarms designed to overwhelm traditional defenses in these confined waters. In a choke point just 21 miles wide, one miscalculation could trigger a global energy crisis. Subscribe now for Stage 3, the economic ripple effects. Strait of Hormuz is more than a military flashpoint. It is the jugular vein of the global energy market. To understand the stakes, we must look at the numbers. Every single day, approximately 20% of the world's total petroleum liquids and a massive portion of liquefied natural gas pass through these narrow waters. This makes the passage a vital artery for international markets, particularly for the industrial powerhouses of Asia, China, India, and Japan, who rely on this flow as a primary economic lifeline. But the true danger of conflict here is the invisible weapon of economic disruption. Even without a total blockade, the mere threat of instability causes maritime insurance premiums to skyrocket overnight. These soaring costs act as an immediate hidden tax on the entire global supply chain, affecting everything from manufacturing to the price of goods on your local shelves. If a sustained disruption were to occur, we wouldn't just see a rise in gas prices. We would witness the trigger of a global inflationary spiral. This risk is forcing a fundamental, long-term shift in how superpowers secure their energy futures. We are moving away from decades of global reliance toward a new era of economic nationalism and strategic mineral alliances. In the Strait of Hormuz, the stakes are no longer just regional. They are a battle for the stability of the global financial order. The silence in the Strait of Hormuz is becoming the loudest sound in the global economy. As of May 2026, this vital artery is no longer a free highway. It has become a contested fortress. We are witnessing the arrival of the new normal. With global oil supply down by nearly 4 million barrels a day, the cost of worldwide inaction is now measured in trillions. But look closer at the shifting shadows. While Western navies enforce a strict blockade, a ghost fleet is emerging. Beijing is quietly carving out a shadow trade, securing private corridors to keep its industrial heart beating, while the rest of the world stalls in the dark. This isn't just about shipping lanes anymore. It is about the death of the globalized system we've known for 80 years. From energy rationing in the streets of Europe to the birth of new defiant defensive blocs in the Persian Gulf, the world is decoupling in real time. The Strait was the ultimate stress test. The result? The era of cheap, guaranteed energy is officially over. The question that remains is, which superpower will be left to control the ruins of the old order? We've tracked this crisis from the first spark to this global turning point, but the full story goes even deeper. Our 15-minute documentary investigation, the definitive deep dive, is coming next. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. Turn on all notifications. In a world of chaos, information is the only true currency. While the world's cameras are trained on the great hall of the people in Beijing, a different kind of diplomacy is being written in the salt water of the Persian Gulf. As President Trump and President Xi enter the heart of their tactical détente this mid-May 2026, the public narrative is one of trade resets and maritime stability. But beneath the formal handshakes, a shadow economy is keeping the global engine running, one that thrives on the very unpredictability that defines modern American foreign policy. It is a high-stakes game of strategic patience, where a single headline from Beijing can shift the path of 1,000 vessels in an instant. To understand the scale of this shadow play, one must look at the math of the blockade. Every 24 hours that the standard shipping lanes remain contested, nearly 20 million barrels of oil, roughly 1/5 of global consumption, are effectively held hostage. This isn't just a regional supply issue. It is a systemic threat to the just-in-time delivery models that sustain Western economies. From the gas pumps in Ohio to the manufacturing hubs in Germany, the ripple effects of a closed strait are absolute. The reality away from the summit is far less polished. Secret negotiations between Washington and Tehran, meant to reopen the world's most critical energy artery, hit a definitive dead end over the weekend. Iran has held firm on 5 non-negotiable conditions, centered primarily on the recognition of absolute Hormuz sovereignty. This demand is a direct challenge to the international freedom of navigation doctrine that has governed these waters for decades. For Washington, the lack of a defined, traditional foreign policy has become its primary weapon. A strategic ambiguity that refuses to offer nuclear concessions for a ceasefire. This isn't just a diplomatic stall, it is a structural breakdown. As both sides retreat to their respective corners, the vacuum of leadership has allowed a secondary, unregulated power structure to emerge in the deep water. The era of the traditional energy market is ending, and the era of the shadow trade has begun. While mainstream cameras captured lavish banquets and optimistic handshakes in the Zhongnanhai Garden, the reality of the 2026 Beijing summit was defined not by what was settled, but by what was swept under the rug. Behind closed doors, the world's 2 largest superpowers reached a tense, strategic stalemate. In his opening remarks on Thursday, Chinese leader Xi Jinping directly invoked the ghosts of antiquity, referencing the Peloponnesian War that erupted between Athens and Sparta in 431 BC. It was a calculated, sobering reminder of the Thucydides trap, the historical paradigm stating that when a rising power threatens to displace an existing superpower, structural systemic war becomes almost inevitable. Critics are left asking a chilling question. Can Washington and Beijing transcend this ancient trap? Or are they already locked into a predetermined collision course? The immediate fallout suggests the latter. While the public headlines trumpeted a fragile maritime truce, where Beijing utilized its back channels to secure safe passage for Chinese commercial vessels through the volatile Strait of Hormuz, a deeper intelligence look reveals the severe limits of American leverage. Sources confirm that the American delegation failed to pressure China into adopting a truly aggressive diplomatic or economic stance against Iran, which remains a critical node in Beijing's energy security matrix. In return, President Xi drew a hard line on the status of Taipei, demanding a fundamental retreat in American policy regarding Taiwan, and pushing for the cancellation of Washington's pending $14 billion arms package. Neither superpower blinked. These 2 core fault lines remain dangerously unresolved. Yet, the most telling indicator of the summit's true nature wasn't the politicians, but the quiet presence of a massive contingent of American corporate titans. CEOs from BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, and NVIDIA traveled in the presidential slipstream. Their mission? A behind-the-scenes push to secure critical mineral flows and lock down market access, effectively acting as a separate commercial track of diplomacy while the geopolitical front lines hardened. As American capital attempts to hedge its bets in China, the tactical landscape in the Persian Gulf enters a dangerous vacuum. Denied absolute backing from Beijing, but left largely unpunished by Western diplomacy. Iran's asymmetric proxies retain their lethal wildcard status. The theater of conflict has expanded. To understand the drone swarms of Hormuz, one must now look to the corporate boardrooms of Wall Street and the high-stakes defiance of Beijing. Subscribe to @Atlas GeoPulse as we prepare for Stage 3, the economic shockwave. When the 2-mile-wide shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz freeze, the global economy does not react in weeks or months. It reacts in fractions of a second. Within the first 24 hours of an enforcement gap, the international maritime shipping industry faces a sudden and existential crisis. Modern global trade relies entirely on the predictability of maritime law and safety. The moment that safety is compromised, insurance underwriters in London and Singapore instantly pull the plug on standard coverage. Risk algorithms are violently recalibrated. The economic reality is immediate and staggering. Hull and cargo insurance premiums spike by more than 400% overnight. Giant, very large crude carriers, each holding upwards of 2 million barrels of crude oil, transform instantly from highly efficient transit assets into uninsurable multi-million-dollar liabilities. Fleet commanders and corporate boards refuse to take the risk. Captains are ordered to immediately drop anchor outside the danger zone, turning the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea into a massive, gridlocked floating waiting room. But this is not merely a crisis restricted to energy markets or gas prices. The true danger cuts far deeper into the foundational fabric of modern industrial society. A single barrel of crude oil is not just fuel. It is the raw chemical baseline for thousands of global supply chains. It is the refined bunker fuel that powers the massive container ships crossing the Pacific with electronics and medical supplies. It is the cracked petrochemical base required for the global manufacturing of plastics, advanced polymers, and pharmaceuticals. Most critically of all, it forms the absolute bedrock of global agricultural fertilizers like synthetic ammonia. As these astronomical energy costs cascade through the international system, a parallel industrial crisis emerges on the factory floors of global superpowers. East Asian manufacturing hubs, heavily reliant on uninterrupted just-in-time energy imports from the Middle East, face immediate operational gridlock. Heavy machinery idles. Across the Atlantic, Western European industrial sectors, already vulnerable to energy volatility, begin to systematically stall as overhead costs eclipse profit margins. The Zhongnanhai stalemate, which began as a tactical maritime military standoff, rapidly and ruthlessly evolves into a brutal race for domestic economic survival. Strategic petroleum reserves offer nations only a temporary fragile shield against this macroeconomic bleeding. As these national stockpiles dwindle over a matter of weeks, global leadership is forced into a dangerous geopolitical corner. Democratic and authoritarian governments alike must eventually make a terrifying choice. Either sit back and absorb a historic, multi-trillion-dollar macroeconomic collapse that will trigger widespread civil unrest, or aggressively deploy heavily armed naval escorts to force the shipping channels open by raw military power. The line separating domestic economic defense from outright global warfare completely dissolves. As supply chains fracture permanently, the century-old rules of free open commerce are discarded. The stage is set for a violent, structural realignment of global power, wealth, and sovereign territory. To understand exactly how the international chessboard is being permanently rewritten by this crisis, you must prepare for our final chapter. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join us for Stage 4, the New World Map. The layout of global power is being rewritten, not by a grand treaty, but by a chokehold on the world's most critical maritime vein. For decades, the global economy relied on a simple assumption: that the United States military would guarantee the free flow of commerce through the Strait of Hormuz. That era is officially over. As the dust settles on the 2026 transit crisis, a fragile, deeply fractured reality has emerged, and the balance of superpower influence has permanently shifted. Washington now faces an exhausting strategic dilemma. In the wake of intense military strikes and a prolonged blockade, the U.S. Navy has found itself anchored to an open-ended, high-cost patrol mission in the Gulf. This American entrapment is heavily driven by the Trump administration's alignment with Israel, whose strategic doctrine rejects an amicable regional peace in favor of completely eliminating any rival military power from Gaza and Lebanon to Tehran. Forced to underwrite this aggressive posture, American forces are stretched thin, policing an increasingly hostile waterway where Iran's newly declared Persian Gulf Strait Authority enforces rigid transit permits. For the United States, keeping the peace has become an expensive, indefinite trap, one that drains vital naval resources away from the Pacific, right when strategic competition with China is reaching a boiling point. While Washington bears the staggering military and political costs of the crisis, Beijing is quietly engineering a massive strategic victory. China has masterfully played both sides. Officially, Chinese diplomats call for stability. Behind the scenes, however, Beijing has utilized its deep ties with Tehran to secure backroom transit exemptions, ensuring Chinese energy tankers continue to slip through the blocked strait while competitors remain stranded. But China's true masterstroke is domestic. Recognizing the extreme vulnerability of seaborne fossil fuels, Beijing is aggressively using this crisis to permanently decouple from Middle Eastern oil. They are rapidly accelerating their transition into a renewable energy superpower, doubling down on massive domestic solar grids and alternative coal-to-chemical supply chains. The traditional players of the Middle East are watching this shifting dynamic and adapting quickly. Seeing a heavily burdened United States and a rising resource-hungry China, regional powers are realizing that relying entirely on Western security guarantees is a relic of the past. From Riyadh to Doha, a quiet geopolitical realignment is underway. Trade agreements, currency settlements, and diplomatic backchannels are turning sharply toward Beijing. The Strait of Hormuz crisis was never just about a shipping lane. It was the catalyst for a fundamental rewriting of global geometry. The United States successfully defended its allies, but in doing so, walked into a geopolitical stalemate. Meanwhile, China avoided the fighting entirely, secured its own future, and stepped into the vacuum. The old global order has fractured. In this new era, true power belongs not to the nation that can deploy the most warships, but to the nation that no longer relies on the choke points of the old world. Geopolitical analysts call it the most complex maritime standoff in modern history, a dual blockade. Since April 13th, the United States Navy, operating under CENTCOM, has enforced a strict cordon encompassing the entirety of the Iranian coastline, intercepting, diverting, or seizing over 90 vessels attempting to access Iranian ports. In response, Tehran has weaponized the geography of the Strait of Hormuz itself, establishing an asymmetric chokehold designed to suffocate global energy trade. It is a high-stakes chess match where both sides are trying to starve each other's leverage without tripping the wire into a total, uncontained regional conflagration. Against the sheer technological dominance of 3 American carrier strike groups operating in the theater, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy utilizes a doctrine of absolute asymmetry. They do not match the U.S. Navy ship for ship. Instead, they rely on small, low-profile, fast attack craft, anti-ship cruise missile batteries hidden in the coastal cliffs, and a massive arsenal of smart sea mines. By operating from shallow, jagged coastal inlets where deep-draft American guided missile destroyers cannot easily maneuver, Iran treats the 21-mile-wide strait not as an open waterway, but as a heavily fortified kill zone. This tactical friction is precisely what sparked the overnight explosion at Bandar Abbas. U.S. naval intelligence assets flagged several IRGC fast attack craft moving under the cover of total darkness, carrying low-signature bottom mines intended for the commercial shipping lanes. In a swift, preemptive response, CENTCOM ordered targeted defensive strikes. The engagement was short, violent, and devastatingly precise. 2 IRGC vessels were neutralized on the water, and an active surface-to-air missile battery along the coastline was completely obliterated. The strikes expose the fundamental paradox of the current peace talks. Under the draft Memorandum of Understanding being negotiated in Qatar, Iran is supposed to cooperate in opening the shipping lanes. For weeks, U.S. Navy minesweeping forces have been working around the clock to clear the waters. Yet, while diplomats debate terms in luxury hotels, IRGC tactical commanders on the ground are actively trying to remine those very same corridors. Washington's message via these strikes is clear. The U.S. will negotiate with Tehran's politicians, but it will physically eliminate any asset that threatens its dominance on the water. The illusion of the Washington-Tehran truce does not simply shatter in the waters of the Persian Gulf. Its fatal shockwaves are actively traveling north, bleeding into a theater where paper agreements have completely lost their currency. On April 17th, diplomats celebrated a hard-fought ceasefire meant to stabilize Israel's northern border and quiet the guns in the Bekaa Valley. But geography refuses to be contained by a press release. Today, that diplomatic framework is in a state of absolute, violent collapse as the regional proxy war rapidly outgrows its borders. Behind the scenes, the friction is structural. While Washington tries to project an image of a managed de-escalation, Israeli leadership has chosen to press the pedal harder. The military objective is uncompromising: the absolute dismantlement of Hezbollah's infrastructure in southern Lebanon. Tel Aviv's calculation is driven by an existential reality on the ground: the relentless, high-tech wave of fiber-optic guided drone attacks that paper truces have failed to stop. For Israel, a ceasefire that leaves these capabilities intact along its northern perimeter is not peace. It is simply a tactical pause, allowing an adversary to rearm. This brings the entire U.S.-brokered peace architecture to a grinding, impossible halt. In the halls of negotiation, Tehran explicitly demands that Lebanon and the fate of Hezbollah be legally bound to any final maritime agreement in the Strait of Hormuz. But the geopolitical reality on the ground has already bypassed the negotiators. As Israeli ground operations expand deeper into Lebanese territory, ordering massive civilian evacuations and striking deep into ancient port cities, the friction becomes an unbridgeable chasm. The strategic takeaway for global analysts is chilling. The Biden-Trump transition team's attempt to treat the Middle East crisis as a series of isolated, compartmentalized disputes is a fundamental geopolitical miscalculation. You cannot separate the security of the global energy chokepoints from the active fires consuming the Levant. They are mathematically linked variables in a singular, region-wide war of attrition. As the Northern Front burns out of control, the diplomatic theater in Washington is about to face its most toxic disruption yet. An ultimatum designed not to forge peace, but to force a collapse. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing continues in Part 4. Behind the closed doors of international diplomacy, peace is often reduced to a set of numbers. In the leaked draft of the Washington-Tehran Memorandum of Understanding, the math appears straightforward on paper. Phase 1 dictates an immediate, mandatory 60-day ceasefire across all maritime corridors. 60 days for diplomats to institutionalize a permanent political settlement. Following that window, a strict 30-day operational timeline is triggered. A 90-day total horizon dedicated exclusively to the physical demining and reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. To a world starved for economic stability, it looks like a masterfully constructed exit ramp from total regional war. But on the black water of the Persian Gulf, diplomacy is an illusion. While drafts circulate through intermediaries, the kinetic reality tells a drastically different story. At the very moment negotiators iron out the text of a truce, U.S. Central Command continues to authorize active engagements. Under the legal umbrella of inherent self-defense, American naval assets are actively conducting targeted strikes against Iranian fast attack craft and active mine-laying vessels. To Washington, these are defensive containment measures meant to preserve the status quo until a signature is dried. To the crews on the water, it is an active, undeclared conflict that refuses to pause for politics. The core systemic failure of the truce is not a lack of political will. It is a fundamental collision of international law. The United States and its Western allies view the Strait of Hormuz through the lens of the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention, an international strait where transit passage is an absolute, unalterable right. But Tehran operates on a starkly different legal doctrine. Relying on historic claims and a strategic alliance with Oman, Iran asserts absolute territorial sovereignty over the narrow 21-mile Chokepoint. They claim the right to control, inspect, and deny entry to any foreign military vessel. This is the fatal flaw of the architecture. You cannot negotiate a ceasefire when both sides completely disagree on who owns the battlefield. The papers are signed, but the guns are firing. And as the fragile truce fractures in the Gulf, an entirely new front is about to ignite to the north. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing continues in Part 3. When asymmetric ultimatums are disguised as peace treaties, diplomacy does not prevent war. It merely schedules it. As the 60-day ceasefire clock ticks down, the structural illusions of the Washington-Tehran Memorandum of Understanding are stripped away, leaving both sides facing the ultimate mechanism of enforcement. If the timeline expires without Iran surrendering its nuclear edge, the alternative is not a return to negotiation. It is the implementation of a total, unyielding maritime blockade designed to completely choke off the Islamic Republic's economic survival. This is the precipice where regional friction escalates into a systemic crisis of global supremacy. For centuries, historians have warned of the Thucydides trap, the dangerous structural friction that occurs when a rising power rivals an established ruling power. In the 5th century before Christ, it was the rapid rise of Athens and the resulting fear instilled in Sparta that made the Peloponnesian War inevitable. Today, that ancient geopolitical dynamic is playing out across the maritime transit lanes of the 21st century. Washington is determined to preserve its historic role as the sole guarantor of absolute freedom of navigation. Beijing, heavily dependent on the unhindered flow of energy through these exact maritime choke points, views Western blockades and targeted naval enforcement as a direct existential threat to its own national security. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a localized flashpoint between regional actors. It has become the primary theater where the world's two largest superpowers are actively testing each other's strategic red lines. The tragic takeaway of the fragile truce is that both sides are operating on an unalterable collision course. The draft agreements and back-channel negotiations are not an architecture for a lasting peace. They are the final, frantic maneuvers of an old world order trying to stave off a systemic shift in global dominance. The papers are burning, the fleets are deploying, and the 60-day countdown is officially live. Thank you for watching this Atlas GeoPulse investigative briefing. The grand strategy is unfolding, and the line in the sand has been drawn. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we step directly into Act 2, the Shadow Fleet Corridor. While diplomats debate the collapsing terms of the Washington Memorandum, a ghost armada is already rendering the Western blockade entirely obsolete. Welcome to the Shadow Fleet Corridor. By mid-2026, the global Shadow Fleet has expanded into a massive structural matrix of over 1,300 aging tankers, accounting for nearly 1 in every 5 oil vessels operating worldwide. This is a decentralized maritime empire engineered specifically to convert aggressive sanctions pressure into a permanent strategic advantage. It functions entirely outside the rules-based international order, relying on opaque shell companies, fake flag registries, and zero Western insurance coverage. The financial lifeline of this ghost network flows along a highly sophisticated trade route connecting the oil terminals of Iran directly to the energy-hungry markets of East Asia. Despite a wave of aggressive maximum pressure designations issued by the United States Treasury and State Departments targeting Iranian vessels and ballistic missile procurement nodes, the flow of illicit crude has reached historic volumes. The ultimate destination for this sanctioned cargo is not the state-owned infrastructure of global superpowers, but the independent, privately owned refineries known as teapots, heavily concentrated in China's Shandong province. To bypass Western naval assets enforcing the maritime embargo, these ghost ships utilize highly deceptive tactical maneuvers. It is an ongoing electronic warfare battle on the high seas. Shadow tankers systematically falsify their automatic identification system data, a practice known as AIS spoofing. By broadcasting false satellite coordinates, a tanker can appear to be sitting anchored safely in international waters, while it is actually docked at a sanctioned terminal loading hundreds of millions of dollars in crude oil. When electronic cloaking fails, the network resorts to highly volatile ship-to-ship transfers in the open ocean, blending sanctioned crude with unsanctioned petroleum to permanently mask its origin. The Western intelligence architecture is no longer just hunting isolated smugglers. They are fighting a highly adaptive state-sponsored criminal enterprise that treats international law as a minor operating cost. The blockade is leaking, the ghost ships are moving, and the secret trade keeping a rogue state alive is about to face a fatal interception. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing continues in Part 2. The digital cloaking mechanisms of the Ghost Fleet are facing an unprecedented kinetic wall. Under Washington's newly escalated economic fury campaign, the United States military has transitioned from standard economic sanctions to an active, physical naval blockade targeting vessels entering and exiting Iranian ports. This is not a passive monitoring mission. Led by U.S. Central Command, the strategic focus is aimed squarely at the largest prize in the shadow trade: the Very Large Crude Carriers, or VLCCs, capable of moving 2 million barrels of oil in a single voyage. The scale of this maritime interdiction campaign is staggering. Recent operational updates from CENTCOM confirm that naval assets and aerial patrol units have already successfully redirected over 100 commercial ships, while physically disabling non-compliant vessels attempting to breach the enforcement parameters. This aggressive enforcement has triggered an immediate, visible bottleneck. Satellite imagery reveals massive idle clusters of over 60 fully laden shadow tankers backed up at the Karg Island anchorage and loitering helplessly outside the Persian Gulf near Chabahar port. They are trapped in a geopolitical holding pattern, unable to export their cargo to East Asian markets. Yet, the Shadow Fleet's architecture is built for survival. As the primary outlets inside the Gulf are choked off, the network's center of gravity is shifting eastward to Southeast Asia. In the waters off Malaysia and the South China Sea, dozens of ghost tankers operate with functional impunity, utilizing unauthorized ship-to-ship transfers to mask the origin of the hydrocarbons before they ever reach destination ports. This creates an intense game of maritime cat and mouse. While the US Navy successfully constrains the flow of crude directly leaving Iran's coast, the secondary decentralized layer of the Ghost Armada continues to bypass the dragnet. It is a high-stakes race against time. The Western blockade is starving Tehran of $500 million in daily revenue, but every single shadow tanker that successfully slips through the eastern sea lanes provides a vital financial injection that keeps the regime's proxy machinery funded. The economic net is tightening, but the Ghost Network is preparing a dangerous, retaliatory countermeasure to break the stranglehold. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing continues in Part 3. When a state-sponsored maritime network is cut off from traditional ports, it does not surrender. It migrates to the shadows of international corporate law. To bypass the physical dragnet of the Western blockade, the architects of the Ghost Fleet have weaponized a complex web of corporate shells and flags of convenience. Tankers frequently switch their registrations between maritime havens like Panama, Liberia, and Gabon in a matter of weeks, creating a dizzying bureaucratic maze that outpaces Western regulatory tracking. But the true danger of this underground network is no longer just economic, it is ecological. Because these 1,300 vessels operate completely outside the rules-based maritime framework, they bypass basic safety protocols. The average age of a shadow fleet tanker is over 20 years old, far beyond the standard operational lifespan of commercial shipping. These aging hulls carry hundreds of millions of gallons of volatile crude oil with zero Western insurance coverage, no structural oversight, and crew members operating under completely falsified maritime credentials. The primary theater for this high-stakes evasion is the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea. Here, outside the immediate kinetic reach of U.S. Central Command, shadow tankers engage in highly volatile ship-to-ship transfers while completely blacked out. They cut their transponders, drift into crowded commercial lanes, and tether themselves together in the open ocean to pump oil from one hull to another. A single mechanical failure or structural breach under these conditions would trigger an environmental catastrophe capable of permanently crippling the fishing and trade economies of Southeast Asia. Western intelligence agencies are facing a paradox. While the naval blockade in the Persian Gulf successfully constrains the direct flow of energy out of Iranian terminals, the secondary corporate layer of the Dark Fleet keeps the wider network operational. It is a highly adaptive structure that treats international maritime law not as a boundary, but as a system to be actively dismantled. And as the corporate shell game reaches its absolute limit, the shadow fleet is preparing to deploy its ultimate economic weapon, one that aims to bypass Western banking entirely. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing continues in Part 4. The true survival mechanism of the Ghost Armada does not lie in its ability to spoof radar or outrun naval blockades. It is anchored in a parallel financial universe that Western intelligence cannot shut down. Following the explosive kinetic escalations of early 2026, the economic war shifted decisively from the water to the digital ledgers of global banking. In a direct, unprecedented challenge to 50 years of dollar hegemony, Iran's parliament passed the act on establishing sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, implementing a mandatory tolling system requiring commercial tankers to clear transit fees exclusively in non-dollar assets, primarily the Chinese yuan. This is the birth of the active petro-yuan corridor. For years, Beijing quietly engineered a backup financial plumbing system to act as a shield against Western economic diplomacy. That system is China's Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS. Serving as a direct challenger to the Western-dominated SWIFT network, CIPS provided a flawless proof of concept as the conflict intensified. State media data confirmed that CIPS shattered all-time records, processing a staggering 1.22 trillion yuan, roughly 178 billion US dollars, in a single day. The geographic hub of this de-dollarization matrix is widening. While Iranian oil flows directly to independent refineries in Shandong province, the financial clearance mechanisms have migrated into the Persian Gulf itself. Utilizing institutions like First Abu Dhabi Bank, which recently became a direct participant in the CIPS network, Tehran and Beijing are utilizing the United Arab Emirates as a premier clearing hub for renminbi liquidity. This effectively allows sanctioned energy products to be bartered, cleared, and settled completely outside the reach of the US Treasury Department. For global macro analysts, the implications are chilling. The Western blockade assumes that cutting off a nation from the dollar-based financial system is a fatal blow. But as major regional heavyweights like Saudi Arabia begin diversifying their payment allocations and allowing up to 41% of certain bilateral trades to settle in alternative currencies, the economic net is tearing open. The petrodollar is no longer the undisputed ruler of the sea lanes. But as the financial firewall solidifies, the Western alliance is preparing a final, desperate cyber counteroffensive. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing concludes in Part 5. When physical blockades leak and alternative financial ledgers bypass the global banking system, the theater of conflict mutates into a completely invisible arena. Welcome to the ultimate mechanism of Western enforcement, the cyber dragnet. Realizing that 1,300 ghost ships cannot be stopped by naval hulls alone, Western intelligence agencies have deployed offensive digital operations designed to structurally blind the shadow network from within. This is asymmetric warfare, modernized for the 21st century, targeting the electronic central nervous system of the Dark Fleet. The digital offensive strikes simultaneously at multiple nodes of the clandestine trade corridor. The true fate of global energy security is rarely decided in public assemblies or televised press briefings. It is negotiated in the shadows, recorded on secure servers, and sometimes completely exposed to the world. Welcome to Act 3, the Islamabad leaks. In mid-2026, an unprecedented intelligence breach fundamentally shattered the delicate facade of Middle Eastern diplomacy. A massive cache of highly classified diplomatic communications, intercepted from the networks of Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, suddenly surfaced in the public domain, exposing a web of secret, backdoor channels that the White House and Tehran desperately hoped would remain buried. The leaked cables lay bare a highly sensitive parallel negotiation track managed out of the Pakistani capital. While the mainstream press was focused entirely on public threats and escalating military postures, the incoming Trump administration's transition team was utilizing Pakistani intelligence channels to quietly broker a high-stakes operational compromise directly with Iranian state actors. The core objective of these clandestine sessions was to engineer a secret protocol for the Strait of Hormuz, an arrangement that went far beyond the compromise terms of the public 60-day Memorandum of Understanding. The raw intelligence reveals an astonishing level of geopolitical pragmatism behind closed doors. The documents contain detailed transcripts of high-level meetings between regional mediators and Iranian envoys, laying out an asymmetric trade-off. Washington would offer unpublicized back-channel sanctions flexibility on regional commerce, provided Tehran implemented strict, verifiable constraints on its proxy drone operations along critical shipping corridors. For weeks, this parallel diplomacy successfully managed the friction on the water, keeping the global energy grid operational while both sides publicly maintained a stance of absolute ideological defiance. But the exposure of the Islamabad leaks has turned a managed diplomatic maneuver into an absolute crisis of trust. The unauthorized publication of these transcripts has stripped away the deniability required for back-channel statecraft. Allies and adversaries alike are suddenly staring at the unvarnished raw mechanics of global power projection, realizing that the public narrative of an unbridgeable conflict was a highly synchronized illusion. The secret agreements are out, the mediators have been compromised, and the fallout is about to ignite a firestorm that threatens to consume the entire regional architecture. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing continues in Part 2. When secret diplomacy is dragged into the public square, the primary casualty is not the policy itself, but the deniability required to execute it. Following the exposure of the Islamabad leaks, the fragile backdoor channels connecting Washington and Tehran have suffered a cataclysmic collapse. The public exposure of these secret protocols forced an immediate, uncompromising retraction from the highest levels of American power. In a high-stakes White House cabinet meeting on May 27, 26, President Trump publicly drew an unyielding line, declaring to PBS News that the United States will offer absolutely zero sanctions relief or financial concessions to Tehran, even if the regime surrenders its highly enriched uranium stockpile. This public declaration has thrown a devastating wrench into the gears of regional mediation. Behind closed doors, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has continued to maintain that diplomatic progress is within reach, working intensively across multiple regional nodes. But Trump's absolute refusal to ease economic pressure has effectively stripped the negotiators of their primary currency. For the Iranian leadership, a framework that demands the total surrender of their nuclear leverage while offering zero economic relief is not a treaty. It is a demand for unconditional capitulation. The strategic trust engineered by Pakistani and regional backchannels has evaporated in a matter of hours. The immediate consequence of this diplomatic paralysis is a rapid, dangerous return to kinetic escalation on the ground. As the political track breaks down, the primary actors are moving swiftly to re-establish their leverage through raw military power. War Secretary Pete Hegseth has openly warned that the United States remains fully prepared to resume massive military action if ongoing negotiations fail to produce a result favored by the White House. The illusion of a managed, compartmentalized peace has officially dissolved. The Islamabad leaks didn't just expose a secret negotiation. They forced both global superpowers and regional actors to abandon their private pragmatism and retreat into their most aggressive public red lines. The back channels are dead, the political options are spent, and the primary actors are now preparing for a direct, unmitigated trial of strength. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing continues in Part 3. It is the world's most critical energy artery, a narrow strip of water through which 20% of the world's petroleum flows every single day. The Strait of Hormuz. For decades, the West believed its global sanctions could choke off hostile regimes by cutting them out of this very water. They were wrong. Instead of isolation, Western pressure forced an alliance that changed global macroeconomics forever. Behind closed doors, a secret pipeline was forged. The Moscow-Tehran axis. When extensive sanctions hit Russia, Moscow didn't freeze. It adapted. By combining forces with Iran, a nation that has spent decades perfecting the art of black market survival, they built a massive parallel energy network. This isn't just a political alliance, it is a highly coordinated multi-billion-dollar business enterprise. Millions of barrels of dark oil flow between these two powers right under the nose of Western intelligence. They share banking workarounds, physical tracking evasion techniques, and a single unified goal: absolute economic survival through economic nationalism. But this economic shield was built to withstand an impending military storm. For years, Israel has viewed Tehran's regional influence and nuclear ambitions as an existential threat, relentlessly lobbying successive U.S. administrations to greenlight a decisive military strike. Under the current Trump administration, that geopolitical pressure crossed a historic threshold, culminating in direct military confrontations aimed at fracturing the regime in Tehran. For critics, it was the ultimate execution of a long-standing Washington playbook for regime change in a sovereign nation. For the alliance, it was a fight for survival. Today, that shadow network faces its ultimate test. As we speak, live diplomatic cables from secret negotiations in Islamabad reveal a massive twist. A proposed 60-day preliminary truce brokered by Pakistan. The framework is built on a strict relief for performance model. Stage 1, an immediate freeze on military hostilities. Stage 2, Iran physically clears its naval mines and the US lifts its crippling maritime blockade. And Stage 3, a high-stakes 60-day countdown to negotiate the permanent handling of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile. On paper, it sounds like a historic breakthrough. The Trump administration claims a peace deal is largely negotiated, offering to unfreeze $25 billion in Iranian assets to stabilize global energy markets. But the reality on the water tells a completely different story. While Washington demands a completely open chokepoint, Iranian state media is singing a different tune, asserting that absolute management and maritime control of the Strait will remain a total Iranian monopoly. Even worse, senior sources in Tehran are already pushing back against Western media claims, stating flatly that they will never hand over their enriched uranium core. The trillion-dollar question is no longer just about diplomacy. It's about execution. If the deal holds, global energy markets stabilize. If it breaks, oil threatens a catastrophic surge toward $200 a barrel, triggering a brutal global recession. To understand how we got here, we have to look past the political theater and look at the physical ships executing this lawless trade. In the next chapter, we go inside the ghost fleet corridors. To understand how a shadow economy survives a total military blockade, you have to look at the lawless mechanics of the open ocean. This is the realm of the ghost fleet, a massive, aging armada of tankers operating entirely outside the boundaries of international maritime law. When the US Navy instituted its strict port blockade, and Iran retaliated by mining the shipping lanes, standard commercial shipping ground to a near halt. Insurance companies refused to cover vessels, and global maritime logistics faced the largest supply disruption in history. But for the Moscow-Tehran axis, the crisis became a highly lucrative protection racket. Tankers participating in the shadow trade do not operate like normal ships. They move through the dark corridors with their mandatory automatic tracking transponders completely switched off. They fly fake flags of convenience, utilize shell companies registered in uncooperative jurisdictions, and operate without standard international insurance. Recent maritime intelligence reveals the staggering scale of this operation. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has effectively seized de facto control of the Strait of Hormuz, forcing passing vessels to obtain direct Iranian permission and compliance. This isn't a maritime security service, it is a multi-million-dollar enforcement mechanism. Reports indicate that ships attempting to pass through the Persian Gulf are being hit with staggering payment requests, with some vessels paying up to $2 million to the newly formed Persian Gulf Strait Authority just for safe passage. For the average consumer, this logistical nightmare translates directly to a cost of living disaster. As transport and insurance costs skyrocket, global markets are reacting with extreme volatility, threatening a long-lasting shockwaves to labor markets and households across Asia and Europe. But as the dual blockade chokes the global economy, the financial landscape underneath these ships is undergoing an even deeper structural mutation. The trade isn't just hiding from American warships, it is actively escaping the American financial system entirely. In the next chapter, we follow the money into the petro-yuan shift. While the world watches the high-stakes standoff on the high seas, an even more dangerous conflict is unfolding silently within the global banking architecture. The black market energy flowing through the Ghost Fleet corridors isn't just evading physical warships, it is actively dismantling the dominance of the United States dollar. Historically, global energy trade required total compliance with the SWIFT banking system, a network heavily monitored and regulated by Western financial institutions. Under this setup, if a nation violated international law, Washington could simply flip a switch, disconnect them from SWIFT, and freeze them out of the global economy. But the total blockade of Iran forced a permanent structural mutation. Enter Beijing. Capitalizing on the crisis, China stepped in as the ultimate buyer of last resort, absorbing millions of barrels of heavily discounted Russian and Iranian crude. The catch: not a single cent of these transactions passes through Wall Street or uses American banks. By settling these massive energy accounts entirely in the petro-yuan, the Moscow-Tehran-Beijing axis has built a parallel financial ecosystem completely immune to Western asset freezes or banking bans. For Washington, this isn't just a sanctions evasion tactic. It is a direct, calculated attack on the petrodollar system that has anchored American global hegemony since the 1970s. If the US dollar loses its monopoly on oil, the American government loses its strongest tool for foreign policy leverage. As other non-aligned nations closely observe this successful blueprint for financial independence, the global economy is rapidly fracturing into two distinct financial blocks. This monetary weapon is completely rewriting the rules of economic warfare, giving hostile regimes a permanent shield against Western pressure. But just as this parallel financial system takes shape, a massive twist from an unexpected mediator has completely upended the geopolitical chessboard. The true climax of this invisible war did not unfold on the battlefield, but in the highly classified diplomatic channels of Islamabad and Tehran. Over the weekend, the geopolitical landscape fractured when United States President Donald Trump announced that a sweeping peace agreement with Iran had been largely negotiated, declaring that the blockaded Strait of Hormuz would finally be opened. But behind the triumphant public headlines lies a volatile text known as the Islamabad Declaration, a 14-point memorandum of understanding heavily brokered by Pakistani Field Marshal Asim Munir. Leaked intelligence from these late-night sessions reveals a high-stakes framework that is anything but settled. Under the proposed terms, a fragile 60-day ceasefire extension would begin, forcing Iran to physically clear its naval mines while the United States lifts its punishing maritime blockade on Iranian ports. To trigger the deal, Tehran is aggressively demanding the immediate unfreezing of $12 billion in assets held in Qatar, using it as a strict precondition before signing a single piece of paper. Yet, as Western diplomats rush to secure a foreign policy victory, state media within Iran has issued a staggering reality check. Hardline factions close to the Supreme National Council have explicitly dismissed Washington's announcements as incomplete and inconsistent with reality, flatly denying that they have agreed to surrender a single ounce of their highly enriched uranium stockpile. On the ground, the deal is trapped in a dangerous deadlock. Washington views the 60-day window as a strict countdown for Iran to permanently dismantle its nuclear core, openly warning that it is a 50-50 coin toss whether a deal is signed or the military campaign resumes to blow the regime to kingdom come. Meanwhile, the Iranian leadership views the truce as a strategic pause, asserting that absolute maritime sovereignty over the world's most dangerous choke point will remain a permanent Iranian monopoly. The stage is officially set for a final catastrophic collision. No matter if the Islamabad Declaration is finalized or the sirens of war wail once again, one reality remains absolute. The old geopolitical status quo is dead. This conflict has permanently shattered the illusion of a single unified global market. By forcing Russia and Iran into a corner, Western foreign policy inadvertently accelerated the birth of a parallel weaponized economy, one secured by a dark fleet on the water and fueled by the petro-yuan in the banks. If this 60-day truce holds, the world may see temporary economic relief, but the deep strategic cracks will remain. Hostile regimes now possess a proven, repeatable blueprint for surviving economic isolation. They know that if they control the physical maritime choke points, they control the economic heart rate of the Western world. But the ultimate survival of this deal may rest on an internal Game of Thrones within Tehran itself. Leaked reports indicate that the diplomatic breakthrough was only made possible after Mojtaba Khamenei, the immensely powerful son of the late Supreme Leader, stepped directly into the vacuum, bypassing the ultra-hawkish factions of the Revolutionary Guard generals who demanded total war. Mojtaba has signaling a willingness to offer face-saving concessions to keep the truce alive, attempting to secure his own grip on power in a deeply fractured nation. As Washington relies on aggressive naval blockades and high-stakes brinkmanship to keep these vital shipping lanes free, the very burden of global security is shifting. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a narrow strip of water in the Middle East. It is the ultimate front line of a multipolar world order. The ships will keep moving, the shadow trade will keep flowing, and the battle for the world's most critical choke points has only just begun. Thank you for watching this Atlas GeoPulse investigation. Hit subscribe to track the next global flashpoint, and let us know in the comments below, is the era of US dollar dominance officially over? June 2026 marks a deeply volatile and highly dangerous inflection point across the entire European theater. On the ground, the tactical reality is currently defined by a massive coordinated surge in high-intensity Russian frontline assaults. These are not broad, sweeping strategic breakthroughs, but rather hyper-aggressive, resource-heavy, localized pushes designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer mass. Observers note that Moscow is burning through armor reserves and localized manpower at an unsustainable, rapid rate. An intentional, high-stakes gamble specifically engineered to force a definitive battlefield conclusion before structural economic cracks widen significantly at home. Yet, the true operational crisis for Kyiv isn't merely this localized frontline pressure. It is a critical, compounding systemic logistics choke occurring hundreds of miles behind the trenches. Ukrainian forces are facing severe operational friction due to a dramatic, unprecedented slowdown in the delivery of promised United States war materials. What was originally intended by Western allies to be a steady, predictable pipeline of advanced strategic defense systems, heavy armor, and precision artillery ammunition has deteriorated into a brutal bottleneck of political gridlock, shipping delays, and bureaucratic friction. This logjam is further exacerbated as regional European transit hubs buckle under the sheer volume of military freight, creating physical supply chain vulnerabilities across continental rail lines and secure ports. Out on the line, frontline artillery batteries and air defense units are being forced into a position of extreme scarcity, strictly rationing their remaining critical hardware and interceptor missiles. As Washington stalls and shipments sit stranded in logistics hubs, the tactical map is actively being redrawn not by raw military superiority, but by sheer supply chain vulnerability. This growing logistical vacuum is leaving frontline forces exposed, creating a dangerous strategic pivot point that is forcing regional European powers to make a sudden, radical recalculation. As the physical frontlines fracture under infrastructure stress, A massive diplomatic realignment is occurring behind closed doors, permanently altering the post-war security architecture. The sudden, controversial walkout of the Trump administration from the critical three-party negotiations has shattered the decades-long Western consensus. It has left a jarring, unprecedented security vacuum right in the heart of Europe, one that has caught traditional transatlantic allies entirely off guard. For the first time in modern history, Brussels is moving independently to fill this void. The European Union is stepping up to take direct, unilateral control of the peace and security negotiations. This historic pivot signals a major, permanent shift toward European strategic autonomy. By moving entirely away from Washington's traditional oversight, European leaders are signaling that they can no longer rely on the volatility of American domestic politics to guarantee continental defense, effectively leaving American diplomats on the sidelines of the biggest peace talks of the century. But while Europe attempts to consolidate this new diplomatic front, Moscow is executing an aggressive economic countermove to secure its own survival. Facing intense, multi-layered Western isolation, Russia has launched a highly publicized international conference focused entirely on alternative financial collaboration. Attended by non-aligned global powers and emerging economies, this summit aims to solidify a parallel global economic architecture. By aggressively bypassing the SWIFT banking system and settling major commodities trades in localized currencies, Moscow is attempting to build a permanent, sanction-proof financial shield. The war is no longer just a battle of attrition in the mud. It is a high-stakes race to see who can restructure global finance and diplomacy first. Nowhere are these economic and physical lines colliding more violently than in the ultra-sensitive maritime choke points of the Black Sea. The critical grain corridors, which serve as the absolute operational lifeblood of global food security and remain a primary financial engine of Ukraine's remaining domestic economic survival, are once again under immense asymmetric tactical threat. As the naval balance of power shifts across the region and deployment of low-cost naval drones complicates traditional freedom of navigation, commercial shipping insurance rates are skyrocketing to unprecedented highs. This compounding economic pressure effectively threatens a secondary, purely commercial blockade, without Russia ever having to fire a single kinetic missile at a civilian hull. For Kyiv, keeping these complex shipping lanes open is not a matter of mere commercial preference or trade optimization. It is a matter of strict, uninterrupted national survival. The revenue generated from these agricultural corridors directly funds the state's baseline civilian infrastructure and stabilizes its currency. For the rest of the world, a sustained shutdown here means an immediate, cascading spike in global commodity inflation, threatening sudden food scarcity and subsequent political unrest across highly vulnerable markets in North Africa and the wider Middle East. This has quietly become the invisible, decisive frontline of the entire conflict. A battle dictated not by trench lines but by maritime logistics, commercial shipping routes, and port infrastructure resilience. Every single safe transit of a bulk carrier represents a massive strategic victory for the West. Conversely, every single drone strike or sea mine detonation near a commercial loading dock sends a macroeconomic shockwave felt directly across global stock exchanges. The Black Sea has transformed into a hyper-volatile economic chessboard where an incident at a single pier can alter the negotiating leverage of superpowers overnight. This brings us to the absolute core of the structural crisis, what geopolitical intelligence analysts are now universally calling the exhaustion paradox. On the surface, the public rhetoric blasting from both Moscow and Kyiv remains entirely unyielding, filled with aggressive promises of total battlefield victory and completely uncompromising diplomatic terms. The fighting out on the lines rages on with terrifying intensity, and deep, irreplaceable reserves of national resources and human capital are being deployed daily with ruthless intent. Yet beneath this performative, hyper-aggressive posturing, both states are quietly signaling a desperate structural necessity to locate a viable, face-saving off-ramp to halt the conflict before internal systems collapse. The underlying reasons for this hidden desperation are rooted in sheer systemic fatigue that can no longer be masked by state-run propaganda or carefully managed media filters. Russia's domestic economy, despite its high-profile alternative financial conferences, aggressive energy pivots toward Asian markets, and heavy reliance on parallel supply chains, is severely overheating under the crushing weight of a total war footing. Domestic inflation is creeping steadily upward. The Russian central bank has been forced to push interest rates to historic, unsustainable highs, and severe compounding manpower shortages are actively threatening civilian industrial production and critical domestic infrastructure maintenance. Moscow is discovering that a war economy is a ticking time bomb. Conversely, Ukraine is facing the bitter, undeniable reality of extreme allied political volatility, an exhausted and traumatized civilian population, and a heavily battered, fragmented civil power grid that faces an incredibly brutal and uncertain upcoming winter season. The reliance on external funding packages has turned long-term military planning into a dangerous guessing game. Both nations are currently fighting at their absolute maximum structural capacity, fully aware that their current operational trajectories are rapidly approaching a critical point of diminishing strategic returns. They are trapped in a dangerous, compounding paradox, deeply forced to escalate aggressively on the physical battlefield simply to secure a marginally stronger hand at a future negotiating table. A table that neither side can truly afford to walk away from much longer. The macro geopolitical map is actively redrawing. The international power players have fundamentally shifted, and the countdown to a forced, highly complex diplomatic resolution has officially begun. In the cold, grey, and unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic, a line has finally been crossed. Under the heavy cover of a moonless night, a mysterious tanker, navigating with its transponders dark to evade detection, was intercepted in a joint high-stakes operation by combined British and French naval forces. This was not a routine boarding procedure, it was a calibrated, deliberate standoff. Specifically, the vessel, a Panama-flagged tanker linked to extensive previous sanctions violations, was tracked for over 48 hours by persistent NATO maritime patrol aircraft before the final intercept order was executed by the surface fleet. We are witnessing a dangerous, irreversible shift in the global rules of engagement on the high seas. Today, we go deep inside this mission to understand why a single intercepted vessel has sent shockwaves through the highest corridors of NATO. We will break down the precise, complex logistical chain of custody, the specific naval maneuvers utilized by the French frigate on scene, and the resulting panic now unfolding in international energy markets. We explore why this incident signals the absolute end of safe passage for the Russian shadow fleet, and why the Atlantic is rapidly being transformed into a permanent, volatile theater of active geopolitical friction. But as the global markets react and the diplomatic doors slam shut, one question remains. Are we entering an era where the high seas are no longer open but contested? The answer, I believe, will shape the next decade of our global economic reality. To understand the true gravity of this recent border shift, we must look beyond the headlines and examine the specific localized tactical maneuvers that have unfolded over the last 48 hours. What we are witnessing is not a disorganized or chaotic push, but a highly disciplined, phased repositioning of mechanized infantry and heavy artillery assets along the northern sector of the contact line. Intelligence reports confirm that these movements are being conducted under the heavy cover of sophisticated electronic warfare packages. This has effectively blinded regional drone reconnaissance and is forcing a complete, immediate shift in how local defense commanders must perceive the evolving battlefield. This, however, is not just about moving troops. It is about controlling the physical geography
of the critical supply corridors that fuel the conflict. By establishing these new, hardened forward positions, the tactical landscape has been fundamentally altered, creating a denial zone that effectively restricts the movement of logistics convoys and vital support elements for miles. We have observed the deployment of mobile long-range air defense batteries, which are now providing a protective umbrella over these new positions. This signals to all observers that this is not a temporary incursion or a probe, but a permanent strategic recalibration of the front line. Furthermore, the integration of real-time satellite telemetry with ground-based command centers has allowed for a level of coordination that we have not seen in this sector since the early, formative months of the conflict. This level of tactical synchronization suggests that the logistical planning behind this shift has been months in the making. As we analyze the topographical data, it becomes clear that these new positions aren't just for defense. They are designed to exert immense, sustained pressure on key junctions, forcing a total, costly redesign of the defensive posture for the entire northern front. But there is an additional layer of complexity here that we cannot ignore. The rapid construction of secondary supply lines, logistical arteries that run parallel to the new front, suggests an intent to maintain this presence through the coming winter season, regardless of the cost. This is a cold, calculated exercise in territorial leverage that leaves very little room for error, and it is a move that effectively forces the opposition to play on entirely new, much more dangerous terms. We are seeing a shift from fluid, reactive engagements to a static, high-stakes blockade of movement, which fundamentally changes the math for every commander in the region. With the tactical reality established, we must now pivot to the strategic consequences. The implications of this border shift extend far beyond the immediate front line, directly challenging the existing security architecture of the entire region. By consolidating these new positions, the maneuvering force is effectively signaling a formal rejection of the status quo that has held since last year, aiming instead to unilaterally dictate the terms of engagement for the coming months. This is a deliberate, calculated attempt to force a complex strategic dilemma upon NATO planners. Do they reinforce the existing defensive perimeter, risking a wider conflict? Or do they risk a massive, irreversible escalation by pushing back against this new hardened front line? This shift also forces an immediate, painful recalculation regarding regional energy and resource control. As we move deeper into the season, these secondary supply lines are not just supporting the military presence, they are creating a security bubble that isolates key infrastructure points from any external oversight or verification. We are looking at a scenario where the economic cost of the conflict is about to rise significantly, as the ability to move assets, both commercial and military, is now subject to the total, unchecked control of a single, hardened operational theater. The strategic reach of this new posture is designed to project power into neighboring areas, creating a buffer that complicates any potential future counteroffensive operations. But there is a much broader, more urgent concern at play here: the systematic erosion of deterrence. When a shift of this magnitude occurs with minimal effective opposition, it sends a clear, worrying signal to other regional actors. It suggests that the window for meaningful preventive action has narrowed, and that the initiative has firmly transitioned to those who are willing to accept the high risks of localized escalation. We are witnessing the emergence of a new, dangerous normal, a high-stakes environment where international deterrence is no longer maintained by treaty or promise, but by the physical, permanent occupation of critical geography. The question remains, how will the broader coalition respond to this new reality when the cost of inaction is clearly rising and the risk of a miscalculated direct confrontation is at its highest point in years? As this situation develops, the focus must now shift to what diplomatic levers remain and whether they are strong enough to prevent this localized shift from turning into a much wider, uncontrolled crisis that could reshape the global security landscape As we look ahead to the next phase of this conflict, we must consider the inescapable reality of what this border shift implies for the coming months. We are no longer discussing a temporary movement of assets, but a fundamental, long-term hardening of the front line. This is not merely a tactical victory for those on the ground. It is a systematic, high-level attempt to impose a new, immovable geographic constraint on the entire region. The question that remains, and one that intelligence analysts are currently struggling to answer, is what the ultimate end state of this maneuver truly is. Are we witnessing the final preparation for a wider, more kinetic phase, or is this the establishment of a frozen, long-term territorial reality? The data, derived from recent signal intelligence and corroborated by satellite imagery, suggests a focus on consolidation rather than further immediate expansion. This indicates that the goal is not to advance across the board, but to lock in these new gains and force the opposition to exhaust their resources on a defensive posture that is now fundamentally unsustainable. Looking at the diplomatic horizon, the room for maneuver is shrinking rapidly. The conventional levers, sanctions, diplomatic protest, and international pressure are proving increasingly ineffective against a force that has essentially locked its own position into the landscape. We are entering an era where the primary determinant of security is not international law, but physical, operational control. In the short term, expect a significant increase in gray zone activity. This means more cyber disruptions, more localized pressure, and a sustained campaign of information warfare designed to keep the opposition in a state of constant, high-level readiness without ever committing to a full-scale clash. For the observer, and for the global energy markets, this confirms that the volatility we have seen is not a fluke. It is the new baseline. As this region transforms into a permanent theater of active containment, the risk of miscalculation remains the single greatest threat to stability. We will continue to track these movements with precision, because in this new maritime and continental age, the small shifts at the border are the harbingers of the next, much larger geopolitical storm.
Following the conclusion of the NATO summit in Ankara, member states have released a comprehensive joint communiqué outlining updated strategic priorities, regional security frameworks, and resource allocations. This document serves as the blueprint for the alliance's operational trajectory over the coming cycle. Our objective today is strictly analytical. To introduce the core pillars of this communiqué, strip away the diplomatic rhetoric, and isolate the actionable policy shifts agreed upon by the alliance. Because the implications of these agreements span multiple geopolitical theaters, this briefing serves as the introduction to a multi-part, granular breakdown. In the subsequent chapters of this series, we will examine the economic, maritime, and structural shifts resulting from this summit. Let us begin. When the heads of state and government convened at the Beştepe presidential complex in Ankara for the 36th NATO summit, mainstream international media framed the event using traditional post-Cold War talking points. They analyzed the meeting as a routine gathering of Western partners reinforcing a legacy alliance. This framing misses the spatial reality of modern power. Geopolitics is bound by geography, and by moving the alliance's primary decision-making center to Turkey, the structural center of gravity has broken away from the North Atlantic. Turkey acts as NATO's ultimate swing state. It is a middle power operating an independent strategic doctrine that balances Western integration against independent regional hegemony. For the first time in the alliance's modern history, member states are being forced to evaluate systemic stability not through a strictly Eurocentric lens, but from a geographic pivot point that directly overlooks the Black Sea, the South Caucasus, the Levant, and the energy corridors of the Persian Gulf. The old post-World War II Atlantic umbrella is facing structural decay, driven by the friction of an emerging multipolar system. Ankara is no longer situated at the margins of the alliance. It has become its central balancing pivot. To understand the calculations made during these closed-door sessions, we must bypass the standard diplomatic rhetoric and focus on the raw logistics of regional positioning. Turkey has successfully used its hosting leverage to place its own strategic vulnerabilities on the alliance's agenda, forcing Western maritime powers to reckon with a 360-degree approach to deterrence that prioritizes the southern flank alongside the Eastern European theater. To accurately assess the structural fragility of the alliance in 2026, the analysis must isolate the explicit strategic doctrine of its primary security guarantor, the United States. President Donald Trump arrived in Ankara executing a transactional model of international relations that treats security architecture as a commercial contract rather than an open-ended public good. The primary friction point of this summit centered on the enforceability of the historic 5% GDP defense investment target. Washington is leveraging its structural monopoly, specifically its advanced intelligence networks, logistical transport pipelines, and the nuclear umbrella, to force a massive, rapid recalibration of European national budgets. From a structural realist perspective, this is a calculation of raw leverage. The United States' core argument is that European reliance on American deterrence, combined with a divergence in foreign policy priorities, represents an unsustainable deficit for the American taxpayer. The newly released Ankara Summit Declaration reveals the immediate impact of this institutional pressure. The text notes that European allies and Canada increased their investments in core defense requirements by more than $139 billion over the past year. Secretary General Mark Rutte confirmed that just 1 year into this aggressive 10-year project, European allies are already investing an average of 4% of their GDP into defense and security. While mainstream analysts present this 4% figure as a triumph of alliance solidarity, an objective assessment reveals it as a defensive maneuver by European capitals designed to preserve the American security guarantee. By explicitly tying the preservation of Article 5 commitments to immediate, multi-billion-dollar domestic defense spending outlays, the Trump administration has fundamentally altered the architecture of the alliance. The strategic consensus is fracturing, while frontline Eastern European states view this spending as an essential physical shield. Western European capitals are treating it as an expensive diplomatic tariff required to prevent a structural American exit from the continent. The most critical operational outcome of the Ankara summit did not occur in diplomatic salons, but during the concurrent NATO Summit Defense Industry Forum. This structure has evolved from a formal networking event into a vital war production board. The final summit declaration announces more than $50 billion in new multinational procurement contracts and joint manufacturing initiatives. This massive capital injection points to a fundamental realization among Western military planners. Modern high-intensity conflict is not decided by superior technology alone, but by industrial depth and mass production. The alliance is attempting to aggregate demand, align cross-border procurement, and eliminate defense trade barriers to accelerate the delivery of deep precision strike systems, integrated air and missile defense assets, and uncrewed combat vehicles. The data reveals a structural transition toward an interoperable transatlantic warfighting cloud and the rapid adoption of powerful artificial intelligence models to manage real-time battlefield logistics. However, the industrial reality presents severe bottleneck challenges. The transition from a peacetime commercial manufacturing model to a high-rate defense production baseline requires rare earth minerals, advanced machine tools, and specialized labor pools that remain vulnerable to global supply chain disruptions. By attempting to build a secure, Western-aligned defense industrial base, NATO is engaging in a geo-economic containment strategy. The $50 billion allocation is an attempt to match the industrial capacity of competing state coalitions. This industrial focus confirms that deterrence in 2026 is no longer defined by troop numbers on a border, but by the physical capacity of a state's factory floor to sustain a continuous supply of precision munitions during a prolonged war of attrition. Capital alone cannot bypass the laws of material constraints. The struggle for dominance is ultimately waged in the processing plants, chemical labs, and deep water foundries that dictate the maximum production thresholds of global defense operations. Let us look directly at how Turkey has successfully reshaped NATO's operational perimeter through the expansion of the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, or ICI. For decades, North Atlantic security was defined entirely by its eastern land borders. In Ankara, the geopolitical calculus was permanently expanded to include the maritime chokepoints of the Middle East. The final Ankara Summit Declaration contains an explicit directive targeting Persian Gulf security, stating unequivocally that Iran must never acquire a nuclear weapon and formally demanding that Tehran fully respect freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. This is a significant institutional pivot. By embedding the security of a 21-mile-wide maritime chokepoint into an official NATO declaration, the alliance is formally connecting Atlantic security to the physical logistics of global energy transit. The strategic objective is to deepen defense industrial cooperation and joint intelligence sharing networks with Gulf partners, including Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, while pulling Saudi Arabia and Oman further into the operational fold. Turkey is acting as the bridge for this expansion, positioning itself as the indispensable logistics hub coordinating security between the European continent and the Western Indian Ocean. This southern strategy is designed to counter the asymmetric denial of service tactics currently choking trade in the Red Sea. By establishing an institutional footprint along the southern flank, NATO is attempting to build a long-term maritime containment network that insulates global supply lines from land-based missile threats and non-state kinetic actors. This represents an expansive reinterpretation of collective defense parameters. By projecting institutional deterrence directly into the Western Indian Ocean, the alliance acknowledges that an economic collapse triggered by chokepoint interdiction is just as catastrophic as a territorial breach, fundamentally linking Western prosperity to the volatile naval dynamics of the Persian Gulf. The integration of the Indo-Pacific Four, consisting of Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, into the core architecture of the Ankara Summit, confirms the total globalization of the alliance's defensive envelope. Western planners have abandoned the fiction that the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific are separate maritime theaters. In a highly integrated global economy, they are a singular, continuous pipeline of goods, energy, and technology. The formalization of joint interoperability standards and cross-theater maritime tracking mechanisms between NATO and its East Asian partners is an explicit attempt to counter deep, non-Western industrial alliances. The real negotiations in Ankara regarding the Indo-Pacific did not focus on territorial borders, but on the security of global semiconductor supply chains, rare earth element processing pipelines, and maritime chokepoints like the Luzon and Malacca Straits. This globalized posture exposes a severe structural vulnerability within the alliance: overextension. By expanding its strategic focus from the North Atlantic to the South China Sea, NATO risks diluting its core regional deterrence capabilities. The strategic math is highly demanding, attempting to balance power simultaneously along the borders of Eastern Europe, the maritime channels of the Middle East, and the critical choke points of East Asia requires an unprecedented level of industrial coordination and financial investment. The Ankara summit has officially transformed NATO from a regional defensive pact into a global institutional balancing mechanism designed to maintain maritime hegemony across the entire Eurasian periphery. This boundless scope strains the physical limits of deployment velocity. By tying the security of Brussels directly to the structural integrity of the Taiwan Strait, the alliance introduces a fragile interdependence where a localized skirmish in Asia can automatically trigger an industrial emergency across European manufacturing corridors. The final verdict of the 2026 Ankara summit is written directly into the text of its closing declaration. Beyond the diplomatic theater and orchestrated displays of solidarity, the final communiqué exposes the precise structural compromises required to maintain institutional cohesion. The central financial pillar is the formalization of a $80 billion military assistance package for Ukraine for the current fiscal year, combined with a binding sovereign commitment from all member states to sustain at least equivalent funding levels through 2027. Crucially, the declaration notes that European allies and Canada are now financing the vast majority of this security assistance through bilateral and multilateral frameworks, utilizing the European Union's multi-year Ukraine support loan structure. This funding model confirms a profound systemic shift. The United States has successfully transferred the primary financial and logistical burden of regional European security onto European states themselves. The Ankara summit will be remembered as the exact moment the traditional American subsidized security architecture of the West was permanently dismantled. In its place stands a highly transactional, hyper-fragmented and globalized balancing network. The classic Atlantic core has been hollowed out, replaced by a multipolar model where security is a commercial contract and geography is weaponized as an economic bottleneck. As global choke points face compounding disruptions from both kinetic conflict and changing climate dynamics, the logistics of power have superseded traditional international law. The chessboard has been fundamentally rearranged, and the nations that fail to adapt their industrial capacity to this new, uncompromising reality will find themselves structurally marginalized in the emerging global order. Sentimentality has been excised from the geostrategic equation. In this fractured landscape, alliances are no longer measured by shared values, but by the raw volume of industrial output and the ruthless control of international shipping lanes. The ink is dry, but the theater of conflict has never been more volatile. In the wake of the newly signed Memorandum of Understanding, a fragile diplomatic framework now sits over one of the most heavily militarized fault lines in the world. On paper, it promises a recalibration of power between Washington, Jerusalem, Tehran, and Beirut. In reality, it may simply be the countdown to the next escalation. For decades, Lebanon's southern border has existed as an open-air chessboard. This latest MOU attempts to draw new boundaries of engagement, shifting the baseline of defensive positioning and foreign intervention. But diplomacy is only as strong as the enforcement behind it. As Washington attempts to anchor its influence and secure commitments from Israel, the shadow of Iran looms large. Tehran's strategic depth relies on keeping its northern tier active, and any document threatening that architecture faces immediate covert resistance. On the ground, the response was instantaneous. Satellite tracking reveals subtle but critical shifts in troop concentrations and hardware deployment just hours after the announcement. Israel's northern command remains on high alert, scanning for the slightest breach of the new terms. Meanwhile, across the Litani River, defensive networks are digging in deeper. The memorandum hasn't brought peace. It has forced both sides to adapt their tactical posture to a new set of rules. To understand where this friction will inevitably spark, we have to look past the political handshakes and analyze the hard geography. The choke points, the valleys, and the urban corridors dictated by this treaty are the exact spots where the next phase of this proxy war will be fought. This isn't just a localized ceasefire. It is a macro geopolitical chess match with global implications. To understand the structural fragility of this memorandum of understanding, we must look past the international signing tables and zoom directly into the sovereign borders of the Lebanese Republic. For Beirut, this agreement forces a desperate, high-stakes tightrope walk. The Lebanese state is currently navigating an economy in a state of near-total collapse, hyperinflation, and severe infrastructural decay. Yet, the formal governing architecture in Beirut must somehow reconcile these desperate domestic realities with a stark, parallel truth. The heavily armed, deeply embedded political and military presence of Hezbollah. Operating effectively as a state within a state, Hezbollah possesses a veto power over Lebanese national security decisions. This MOU, therefore, demands strict diplomatic compliance from a sovereign entity that does not hold a monopoly on violence within its own territory. The text of the accord pressures Lebanon to assert formal, exclusive military control over its southern frontier, specifically enforcing a demilitarized zone that directly challenges decades of embedded operational architecture. For the Lebanese armed forces, pushing to aggressively fulfill these clauses risks triggering intense internal political and sectarian fractures. If the state forces the issue, it threatens the delicate domestic equilibrium that has kept the country from sliding back into civil conflict. But if it fails to act, the treaty immediately collapses under the weight of non-compliance, leaving the nation completely exposed to devastating military retaliation from across its southern border. Beirut is caught in a geopolitical vice, where internal stability and external survival are in direct opposition. This domestic dilemma directly feeds into the broader Iranian counter-calculus. From Tehran's perspective, this diplomatic shift is never looked at through the lens of local stability or Lebanese welfare. Instead, it is analyzed strictly by how it impacts the broader axis of resistance. For decades, Lebanon has served as the critical northern tier of Iran's forward defense design, a primary anchor intended to project regional power and establish a massive asymmetric counterweight against its primary adversaries. Any document or treaty that seeks to structurally alter, restrict, or dismantle this forward architecture is viewed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a direct threat to Iran's own strategic depth and long-term regional deterrence strategy. Open-source satellite tracking and regional signals intelligence suggest that Iran's response to the MOU is already operating on a highly coordinated, dual-tracked system. Publicly, Tehran may allow local political channels in Beirut to engage with the diplomatic framework to alleviate immediate economic or military pressure on its partners. Covertly, however, the flow of logistics, alternative supply paths through Syria, and command and control networks are being aggressively adapted to the new constraints. The Iranian strategy is built on long-term systemic resilience rather than immediate confrontation. Their strategists are calculating exactly how to recalibrate their proxy networks so that even if the formal terms on the paper are technically met, the underlying balance of regional deterrence remains firmly tilted in their favor. To fully comprehend the structural durability of this memorandum of understanding, we must look entirely beyond the immediate border friction and analyze the overarching U.S. diplomatic architecture driving this framework. For Washington, this mediation is not merely a localized ceasefire, nor is it a temporary pause in hostilities. It is a highly calculated strategic attempt to construct a long-term stabilization goals template across an historically volatile corridor. By offering formal security guarantees and directly underwriting the enforcement mechanisms of the treaty, the United States is attempting to achieve a dual objective: securing its traditional sphere of influence while anchoring regional powers to a standardized, predictable diplomatic matrix. But this architecture is built on shifting sand. The multi-layered commitments required to sustain it mean that any failure in enforcement doesn't just collapse the local agreement, it fractures American diplomatic credibility across the entire hemisphere. However, this American architecture faces immediate, friction-filled resistance from its primary regional ally. Israel's deep reluctance to fully accept the terms of the MOU stems from an acute, deeply ingrained tactical skepticism. From Jerusalem's perspective, paper guarantees historically do little to halt asymmetric threats. Israel's security cabinet views the diplomatic framework with profound caution. The core of their concern is operational. They fear that enforcing a conditional pause will simply grant adversarial networks the sanctuary needed to reorganize, rearm, and reinforce their positions directly along the northern perimeter. For Israeli military planners, any diplomatic constraint that restricts their operational freedom of action or forces a reliance on third-party verification is viewed not as a compromise, but as a profound strategic risk. Consequently, their current compliance remains highly transactional, deeply conditional, and entirely dependent on immediate, measurable enforcement on the ground. This internal tension between Washington and Jerusalem creates an immediate, broader geopolitical ripple across the globe, forcing international observers to recalibrate their own strategic calculus. For Euro-Atlantic allies, the MOU is viewed through the lens of crisis management, a necessary mechanism to prevent a wider, uncontainable regional escalation that could directly destabilize continental security, trigger unprecedented migration flows, and fracture an already strained international order. Conversely, the regional Arab states are observing this geopolitical shift with calculated neutrality. For these capitals, the critical metric of success is not found in the immediate territory of the Levant. Instead, their focus is fixed firmly on the maritime security architecture of the global energy chokepoints, specifically the Strait of Hormuz. The signing of the MOU has fundamentally shifted the covert rules of maritime control. While formal international transit corridors remain legally and technically open to commerce, the underlying intelligence indicates a highly contested, aggressive reality on the water. The Gulf states are currently tracking an invisible ledger, determining exactly who exercises de facto operational control over these vital sea lanes in the wake of the treaty. For Eastern economic competitors, most notably China, this Western-led diplomatic architecture is a profound double-edged sword. Beijing relies heavily, almost existentially, on the uninterrupted flow of energy through the Strait of Hormuz to fuel its massive industrial base and maintain domestic stability. This dependence forces a posture of rigid, unyielding pragmatism. Chinese state planners remain intensely watchful, calculating whether Washington's mediation will successfully stabilize the global supply chain, or if the deep, underlying friction between Israel, Iran, and sovereign proxies will trigger a sudden, systemic breakdown of maritime transit rules, shattering the fragile architecture of global commerce. While diplomatic architecture shapes the political horizon, the true litmus test of regional stabilization is written in the language of maritime commerce and energy infrastructure. The Eastern Mediterranean, once a flashpoint of competing naval postures, is transitioning into a critical node for global energy security. For years, massive natural gas fields like Leviathan and Aphrodite remained geopolitical wildcards. Highly lucrative, yet vulnerable to sudden escalation. With Washington's long-term security guarantees acting as an anchor, international consortia are reassessing their risk profiles. Exploration vessels and deep-sea drilling rigs are resuming operations, but the commercial architecture remains fragile. Shipping corridors through these waters are the lifeblood of international trade, and any perceived shift in regional stability alters the mathematics of global logistics instantly. This fragility is felt most acutely not on the open sea, but within the underwriting boardrooms of London and Singapore. Regional insurance premiums serve as a real-time barometer of geopolitical friction. When proxy threats loom or naval posturing intensifies, war risk premiums spike, forcing maritime carriers to choose between absorbing unsustainable overheads or diverting multi-million-dollar cargo vessels around the Cape of Good Hope. A stabilized Eastern Mediterranean acts as a pressure valve for these supply lines. Reductions in transit risk translate directly to lower operational friction, stabilizing the cost of moving goods between Eastern production hubs and Western consumer markets. Yet, market intelligence suggests that commodity traders remain cautious, pricing in the ever-present risk of peace breaking down. The ripple effects extend far beyond regional transit routes. Modern supply chains operate on a just-in-time methodology, where a 48-hour delay in a strategic maritime corridor can disrupt manufacturing schedules across the Euro-Atlantic zone. Fragility in the East Med doesn't just threaten local extraction. It introduces volatility into broader global energy markets, directly influencing the landing costs of liquefied natural gas and crude oil worldwide. This brings us to the core reality of modern economic intelligence. Regional stability is no longer an isolated diplomatic triumph. It is a critical prerequisite for global supply chain resilience. As the standard-bearers attempt to lock in these stabilization goals, the global markets watch the horizon, fully aware that a single fracture in this diplomatic architecture could trigger an immediate, systemic shockwaves across the global economy. It is one of the most heavily guarded stretches of water on Earth, and a single miscalculation could instantly paralyze global trade. While the world watches major battlefields, a quiet, dangerous escalation is unfolding in the shadows of the world's most critical maritime chokepoints. Open-source intelligence reveals a sharp pivot away from covert shadow fleets toward direct, overt tactical postures. Proxy forces and state actors are positioning advanced hardware along key transit corridors, systematically testing the red lines of international maritime law. This is no longer a localized phenomenon, from gray zone drone strikes near European borders to tense, unyielding standoffs in contested Indo-Pacific waters. The risk to global energy security and vulnerable submarine infrastructure has reached a critical threshold. Satellite imagery and maritime tracking data paint a sobering picture. Current deployment patterns suggest a permanent realignment of naval power, explicitly designed to challenge long-standing freedom of navigation frameworks. Analysts monitoring these telemetry feeds warn that the traditional architecture of maritime deterrence is being deliberately eroded by asymmetric tactics. Commercial shipping lines, once insulated by international convention, are now forced to navigate an environment where sovereign boundaries are routinely ignored. The data reveals an undeniable trend. The consolidation of anti-access and area denial capabilities across primary choke points is transforming open trade routes into highly volatile geographic bottlenecks. The economic intelligence indicates that international markets are already bracing for a long-term landscape defined by high friction and persistent operational risk. As these maritime flashpoints multiply, the line between regional deterrence and global conflict continues to blur. The complex web of modern supply chains means that a localized shock in a single strait will immediately trigger a cascading systemic failure across global production networks. The question confronting economic and military intelligence planners is no longer if a disruption will happen, but when and how resilient the international response will be. The diplomatic and financial architecture constructed over decades is facing its most rigorous test, and the horizon suggests that the friction points will multiply before they stabilize. As these structural shifts unfold, maintaining an objective, data-driven perspective remains paramount. Stay tuned as we continue to track these developing fronts with unbiased intelligence. This is Atlas GeoPulse. The public accounts have collapsed, exposing a deeply coordinated paper trail across regional networks. What began as isolated data anomalies has solidified into a systematic compromise of institutional transparency. In this third act of the Islamabad leaks, we peel back the administrative layers to trace the exact deployment of unaccounted assets, hidden communication logs, and verified operational interference. The evidence points to a deliberate framework designed to shift policy mechanisms behind closed doors. We begin our investigation at the source of the initial security rupture. This is Part 1. The true fate of global energy security is rarely decided in public assemblies or televised press briefings. It is negotiated in the shadows, recorded on secure servers, and sometimes completely exposed to the world. Welcome to Act 3, the Islamabad leaks. In mid-2026, an unprecedented intelligence breach fundamentally shattered the delicate facade of Middle Eastern diplomacy. A massive cache of highly classified diplomatic communications, intercepted from the networks of Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, suddenly surfaced in the public domain, exposing a web of secret, backdoor channels that the White House and Tehran desperately hoped would remain buried. The leaked cables lay bare a highly sensitive parallel negotiation track managed out of the Pakistani capital. While the mainstream press was focused entirely on public threats and escalating military postures, the incoming Trump administration's transition team was utilizing Pakistani intelligence channels to quietly broker a high-stakes operational compromise directly with Iranian state actors. The core objective of these clandestine sessions was to engineer a secret protocol for the Strait of Hormuz, an arrangement that went far beyond the compromise terms of the public 60-day Memorandum of Understanding. The raw intelligence reveals an astonishing level of geopolitical pragmatism behind closed doors. The documents contain detailed transcripts of high-level meetings between regional mediators and Iranian envoys, laying out an asymmetric trade-off. Washington would offer unpublicized back-channel sanctions flexibility on regional commerce, provided Tehran implemented strict, verifiable constraints on its proxy drone operations along critical shipping corridors. For weeks, this parallel diplomacy successfully managed the friction on the water, keeping the global energy grid operational while both sides publicly maintained a stance of absolute ideological defiance. But the exposure of the Islamabad leaks has turned a managed diplomatic maneuver into an absolute crisis of trust. The unauthorized publication of these transcripts has stripped away the deniability required for back-channel statecraft. Allies and adversaries alike are suddenly staring at the unvarnished raw mechanics of global power projection, realizing that the public narrative of an unbridgeable conflict was a highly synchronized illusion. The secret agreements are out, the mediators have been compromised, and the fallout is about to ignite a firestorm that threatens to consume the entire regional architecture. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing continues in Part 2. When secret diplomacy is dragged into the public square, the primary casualty is not the policy itself, but the deniability required to execute it. Following the exposure of the Islamabad leaks, the fragile backdoor channels connecting Washington and Tehran have suffered a cataclysmic collapse. The public exposure of these secret protocols forced an immediate, uncompromising retraction from the highest levels of American power. In a high-stakes White House cabinet meeting on May 27, 26, President Trump publicly drew an unyielding line, declaring to PBS News that the United States will offer absolutely zero sanctions relief or financial concessions to Tehran, even if the regime surrenders its highly enriched uranium stockpile. This public declaration has thrown a devastating wrench into the gears of regional mediation. Behind closed doors, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has continued to maintain that diplomatic progress is within reach, working intensively across multiple regional nodes. But Trump's absolute refusal to ease economic pressure has effectively stripped the negotiators of their primary currency. For the Iranian leadership, a framework that demands the total surrender of their nuclear leverage while offering zero economic relief is not a treaty. It is a demand for unconditional capitulation. The strategic trust engineered by Pakistani and regional backchannels has evaporated in a matter of hours. The immediate consequence of this diplomatic paralysis is a rapid, dangerous return to kinetic escalation on the ground. As the political track breaks down, the primary actors are moving swiftly to re-establish their leverage through raw military power. War Secretary Pete Hegseth has openly warned that the United States remains fully prepared to resume massive military action if ongoing negotiations fail to produce a result favored by the White House. The illusion of a managed, compartmentalized peace has officially dissolved. The Islamabad leaks didn't just expose a secret negotiation. They forced both global superpowers and regional actors to abandon their private pragmatism and retreat into their most aggressive public red lines. The back channels are dead, the political options are spent, and the primary actors are now preparing for a direct, unmitigated trial of strength. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing continues in Part 3. When political backchannels freeze, the language of diplomacy is instantly replaced by the kinetics of asymmetric warfare. With the Islamabad leaks rendering secret negotiations politically toxic, the Iranian leadership has pivoted completely away from the bargaining table to unleash its most potent asymmetric option, its region-wide proxy network. Tehran's calculation is structural and highly deliberate. By activating its proxy nodes across Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf states, the regime aims to demonstrate a stark geopolitical reality that blocking their oil exports will extract an immediate, unpayable cost from the global economy. The tactical execution of this counteroffensive relies on a highly disruptive, low-cost doctrine. Rather than engaging in conventional fleet battles against advanced Western naval assets, proxy units are deploying waves of highly sophisticated, low-altitude one-way attack drones. This creates a critical vulnerability for traditional defense architectures. While the Western alliance invests billions in high-end, multi-layered air defense grids designed to intercept ballistic threats, clusters of low-flying unmanned aerial systems can systematically evade early warning sensors. They skim just above the terrain, weaponizing the geography of the region to strike critical infrastructure and logistics hubs with zero warning. This reality has fundamentally transformed the security equation for forward deployed forces and commercial transit lanes alike. From Kuwait and Iraq down through the energy corridors of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the sheer proliferation of these low-cost drone capabilities has outpaced traditional countermeasures. For military strategists, this is the proxy trap in its purest form. An adversary utilizing a $1,000 drone can successfully neutralize or bypass a multi-million-dollar interceptor missile, turning the mathematics of modern defense entirely on its head. As the proxy offensive intensifies, the regional architecture is rapidly approaching a systemic breaking point. The lines of communication are completely severed, the drones are airborne, and the illusion of a contained, isolated maritime dispute has been permanently shattered. The conflict is no longer confined to the waters of the Strait. It has evolved into a region-wide war of attrition where traditional military superiority is facing its ultimate technological challenge. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing continues in Part 4. When asymmetric drone strikes begin paralyzing critical infrastructure, the boundary between proxy, gray zone friction and total regional warfare completely evaporates. Following the destruction of the Islamabad backchannels, The Middle East has entered a rapid, uncontrollable escalation helix. No longer hiding behind deniable proxy networks, the primary actors are moving heavy conventional assets directly to the front lines. Western naval groups, spearheaded by advanced carrier strike forces, are consolidating their defensive postures inside the Gulf of Oman, establishing an unyielding perimeter designed to completely isolate the Iranian coast. The immediate trigger for the next phase of this crisis is a dramatic shift in Tehran's internal command structure. Realizing that their economic survival is completely choked off by the naval blockade, the hardline factions within the Islamic Republic have authorized a full tactical mobilization. Revolutionary Guard missile units have deployed highly advanced anti-ship ballistic arrays and supersonic cruise missiles along the jagged coastlines of the Musandam Peninsula. This places Western naval vessels and global commercial shipping directly within the crosshairs of a dense, multi-directional kill zone, turning the narrow waters of the Strait into a tactical shooting gallery. For global defense analysts, this posture represents the ultimate endgame of deterrence failure. When both sides believe that retreat means absolute strategic defeat, every defensive movement is interpreted by the adversary as an imminent act of war. The United States has reinforced its forward air bases across the Gulf states, while War Secretary Pete Hegseth has reiterated that American forces are fully locked, loaded, and prepared to execute overwhelming kinetic strikes against internal Iranian infrastructure if the regime attempts to close the shipping lanes. The tragic reality of the escalation helix is that the mechanism of conflict has outpaced the speed of human decision-making. Automated air defense systems, satellite tracking networks, and pre-delegated launch authority mean that a single technical miscalculation or an errant radar glitch on either side will instantly ignite a systemic conflagration. The diplomatic papers have turned to ash, the countdown has expired, and the fleets are staring at each other across a hair-trigger line in the sand. Subscribe to Atlas GeoPulse. The briefing concludes in the grand finale of Act 3. When the secret architecture of back-channel statecraft is completely exposed and publicly disavowed, the resulting strategic vacuum cannot be filled by diplomacy. It can only be filled by an absolute, unmitigated trial of strength. The fallout from the Islamabad leaks has permanently shattered the illusion that this conflict could be quietly managed or neatly compartmentalized behind closed doors. With the transition team's parallel channels thoroughly compromised, both Washington and Tehran have completely abandoned their private pragmatism, retreating instead into their most volatile, uncompromising public red lines. The structural tragedy of this breakdown mirrors the classic dynamics of ancient systemic collapse. In the final phases of the Peloponnesian War, when the backdoor financial arrangements between Spartan commanders and Persian satraps were dragged into the light, the option for a conditional negotiated peace evaporated. The exposure forced the primary actors to escalate their kinetic commitments, transforming a series of localized gray zone skirmishes into an existential struggle for total regional dominance. Today, across the heavily fortified sea lanes of the Middle East, that exact ancient blueprint is playing out with terrifying digital precision. On the water, the time for signaling has officially expired. The United States has reinforced its forward air bases and locked its carrier strike groups into aggressive launch postures, while War Secretary Pete Hegseth has openly warned that the American military is fully prepared to execute overwhelming kinetic strikes against internal infrastructure if the shipping lanes are compromised. In response, Revolutionary Guard missile brigades have fully activated their anti-ship ballistic arrays along the Musandam Peninsula, creating a hair-trigger kill zone that places the global energy grid on the precipice of an uncalculable explosion. The ultimate takeaway of the Islamabad leaks is that deterrence failure is rarely a sudden accident. It is a slow, mathematical accumulation of incompatible timetables. When a rising network of parallel economies and